hypnotized.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Alf Museum's Moment of Time Speaker Series. My name is Gabriel Santos. I am the collections manager and our
Hi
curator for
everyone,
the
I'm
Alf Museum,
Laura,
and I'm
senior
really
at the Webb
excited
Schools.
to
I'm
be
a
joined
second year
today
advanced studies
by
and
three
paleontology
of our
researcher.
amazing
And last year I
research
studied
scholars.
eastern mammals in the Sage Creek
So,
Basin of Montana, but now I'm reviewing the work of
let's
the
go ahead
Raymond
and
M.
start
Alf
with
Museum of
introducing
Paleontology
everybody
at
today.
Barstow, California.
How about we start with Laura?
Hi everyone, my name is Rachel Hom, and I'm currently a senior here at the Webb Schools of California. This is my second year in the Advanced Studies Paleontology program, and over the past 2 years, I've been studying Miocene mammals from the Barstow Formation of California.
Nathan, how about you?
All right. Hi, my name is Nathan Choi. I'm a senior at the Webb Schools of California. I've been in the Advanced Studies program for 2 years as well. And over these last 2 years, I've been researching an artiodactyl from the Barstow Formation.
Awesome. Well, thank you all again so much for joining us today for Moments of Time. For those of you who may not know, the Alf Museum was started by a really special person, Dr. Raymond M. Alf, who was a teacher at the Webb Schools. And he started this really amazing program where we're able to teach our students about paleontology through firsthand research and experiences. So that's what we're going to do today. We are going to hear about some of the amazing research that these three peccary scholars have been doing on the Barstow Formation. So they're going to go ahead and do their presentation. So if you have any questions for our scholars, please put them in the chat. And also, we put a link in the chat. If you have a second, please fill it out just so that we can figure out who is joining us today. So why don't we go ahead and start with Laura?
Of course, let me share my screen. Okay, so today our presentation is on education, collections, and research in the Barstow Formation from 1991 to the present day by the Webb Schools and the Alf Museum of Paleontology. The Barstow Formation is from the Middle Miocene, which occurred approximately 16.3 million years ago to 13.6 million years ago. It is located in the Mud Hills, approximately 15 kilometers northwest of Barstow, San Bernardino County, California, and it contains fossil mammals of late Hemingfordian, which is approximately 20.6 to 16.3 millions of years ago, through the Barstowian age. The formation is about 1,000 meters thick, composed of a sequence of sediments produced by a river, lake, and volcano, and subdivided into the owl conglomerate, middle, and upper members. In 1935, Raymond Alf, a math science teacher who became passionately devoted to the study of paleontology, gathered some Webb students, including Bill Webb, and took his first fossil collecting trip to Barstow after stumbling across a beautiful fossilized horse jaw in a photo shop in Claremont Village. Only a few teeth and bones were found, but the trip marked the beginning of what was to lead to hundreds of fossil collecting trips to Barstow by Alf. Alf returned with 7 students to Barstow in November of 1936, and the important discovery and publication of the new genus and species of peccary, Disohius fricki, by Stock in 1937 changed his life and led to the founding of the Raymond M. Alf Museum of Paleontology. The next trip to the Barstow Formation resulted in a large collection of fossil vertebrae. This recent success and the lingering euphoria over the discovery of the new peccary species fired Alf's desire to expand the scope of his search for fossils. Here's another picture of Alf with 5 Webb students on a collecting trip to the Barstow Formation. And on a trip to the west end of the Barstow outcrops in an area known as the Fuller's Earth Canyon, student John Tudor found a partial skull of this rare horse in the upper member of the Barstow Formation that preserved almost the entire upper dentition. And this partial skull eventually became the type specimen of the Megahippus mckenni, which is a middle horse skull. And it was cataloged as RAM 910 and described by Tedford and Alf in 1962. At the same time, as an academic paleontologist, Alf taught a large classroom of Webb students in the lower level of the Thomas Jackson Library, which became his classroom and museum from 1939 to 1968. Unfortunately, a growing problem with the collections made by the Peccary Society was the issue of proper storage and display space. There just wasn't enough available space in the Alf Classroom Museum and Jackson Library, so fossils were stored all over campus. For example, this bear dog trackway was stored in a corner of a Quonset hut used by Webb maintenance staff, and it was obvious that a new museum building was needed to house the collections. Once a fundraising drive launched to finance the museum succeeded, construction on the museum began. And the result was the opening of a new 2-story museum in 1967 with 8,000 square feet of exhibit space and 2 large rooms to house collections. At the dedication ceremony, the museum was formally named the Raymond M. Alf Museum after its founder, and above the entrance, local artist Millard Sheets designed a mosaic of a peccary with flames projecting from its body, which signified the flames of enthusiasm, in reference to the passionate efforts of the Peccary Society in creating this museum. And Alf was extremely proud of the new museum and referred to it as a living memorial to what students and teachers can accomplish together. Today, the Alf Museum is the only accredited museum situated on a secondary school's campus. And to document the history of the Alf Museum, Dr. Don Lofgren and Richsavi Anand wrote 75 years of fieldwork in the Barstow Formation by the Raymond M. Alf Museum of Paleontology and described the early to middle years of the Alf Museum for the first time ever. By the time Dr. Lofgren became museum director in 1991 and began to renew collecting efforts at Barstow, the Alf Museum and the Webb Schools published their scientific discoveries. Here are 3 examples of the 20 total Barstow research papers written by Alf Museum staff and Webb students. The first paper is on a bear dog, and the second paper is on snails, and the last one is on horses. While Lofgren and Anand reviewed the work of history of the museum in its early years, several scientific discoveries were made after the paper was published in 2010. Therefore, we are now compiling all of the previous research at Barstow and primarily reviewing the history of the Alf Museum from 1991 to the present comprehensively, which was never done before. And from 1992 to 2021, there were a total of 1,831 adult and 3,022 students from the Webb Schools in attendance on collecting trips to the Barstow Formation. We obtained the data for each year from the museum director's field notes, documenting the honors paleontology class trips, Webb trips, alumni trips, and freshman paleontology or evolutionary biology trips. The light gray color on the graphs represent the number of students, while the darker color represents the number of adults. And overall, the numbers of participants increased over the years. However, in 2010, there was no student trips to the Barstow Formation due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And here's a brief summary of the data. On average, there were a total of 67 adults and 107 students each year on trips to the Barstow Formation from 1993 to 2019. And this contributed to our collection of over 17,000 fossils at the Alf Museum, of which 8,429 are currently cataloged. And when new students first attend Webb, they all attend the freshman peccary trip and prospect for fossils. Since there's so many freshmen each year, you can see how Webb takes the yellow school bus to the Barstow Formation. And this is an image from my freshman peccary trip with my class of approximately 50 students, and I still remember how happy I was when I first found my fossil of a horse jaw fragment. And here's another older picture of a freshman peccary trip in which 32 students squished into one car. And once the students arrive and set up camp, they use peccary pans to cook food, which sometimes includes fried rice, fajitas, and etc. Not only are they excited to look for fossils, but they also get to enjoy their time with friends and create memories of sleeping under the stars. The next morning, they go on a hike to the fossil outcrops and look for fossils with the guidance of teachers like Dr. Lofgren and Dr. Parkey. After searching for fossils, the students return back to the campground where they make a bonfire and roast marshmallows. In my sophomore year, I went on another peccary trip, and I remember how my entire class sat around the bonfire and sang Riptide together. Other than freshman peccary trips, there are also summer trips and alumni trips. And in this picture, you can see alumni with their families at the Barstow Formation. And after fossils like this one are discovered on trips, collecting groups preserve the fossils in casts and excavate them. And once they are brought back to the Alf Museum, staff members and students in the Paleontology Museum Lab afternoon activity carefully prepare each fossil for collections and research, contributing to scientific knowledge. And in our research paper, Rachel and Nathan will describe their discoveries about a bone-crushing dog, a camel, and an antelope. And Rachel will take on from here. Thank you.
Hi everyone. So like Laura said, I will be presenting my research on my identification of fossils of a bone-crushing dog. These fossils are pictured here, and they are formally cataloged in the museum's database as RAM 21539. So I will be referencing RAM 21539 pretty often in my presentation. So note that I'm referring to these two specimens. On the top, you can see an articulated jaw, and on the bottom, you can see a foot of a carnivore. And this picture was taken before further preparation was done. So you can see that these fossils were found directly adjacent to each other. Last year, my goal was to identify the specimens and provide a systematic description of them. Because school was online, I was tasked to solely identify these specimens based off of pictures that my mentor, Dr. Lofgren, sent me and other basic information. He told me that the specimens were collected from the RAM locality B200511 by Dr. Andrew Farkey in May of 2011, which is a locality in the upper member of the formation, specifically near the Hemiscion quarry. So the first step in my research was to really narrow down the possible species that RAM 21539 could be. So I referred to Darren Paniak's paper that was published in 2009, in which he provided revisions to the biostratigraphy and biochronology of the Barstow Formation based on several mammalian megafauna. So in this paper, he includes a figure that shows where known mammalian megafauna have been found throughout the Barstow Formation. And you can see that this figure essentially mimics the three members of the formation. So like Laura said before, there's like the owl conglomerate member, the middle member, and the upper member. And I was looking for the upper member. So I looked to the left of this figure and located the skyline tuft, because this is where the base of the upper member begins. I looked at all of the species that had occurrences above this line, occurrences being represented by these small horizontal lines. And then knowing that these specimens were carnivores, I eliminated all the non-carnivore species. In the end, I found that there were 13 possible species of carnivores that had been previously found in the upper member of the Barstow Formation, and they are highlighted up above. Within this group, there are 7 canids, which are informally known as dogs, 1 amphicyanid, which is informally known as a bear dog, 1 procyanid known as a raccoon or a ringtail, 1 ursulid, which is a bear, 2 mustelids, which are weasels, badgers, or ferrets, and 1 felid, which is a cat. And so knowing that there were quite a few species that the specimens could represent, I had to analyze the dentition of RAM 21539 more in depth. Here is an occlusal view, or in other words, a bird's eye view of the specimen. This picture was taken after preparation, so that is why you can no longer see the foot. But generally speaking, the first molars or M1s of the mammals can be diagnostic of a particular species. So this means that further analysis of this tooth pictured right here can be analyzed in detail in order to present defining characteristics of a particular species. So my goal was to really analyze this tooth belonging to RAM 21539. However, in this case, the cusp morphology, which is generally analyzed, is hard to discern because of the severe wear on the tooth. So I had to resort to other methods. What I did was that I looked towards the molar size of the M1 belonging to RAM 21539 and compared it to the sizes of the M1s belonging to 13 other carnivore species. And so as you can see in the table, the width of the molar of RAM 21539 is 11.38 millimeters, and the length is 29.09 millimeters. I took the rest of these measurements listed in the table from a variety of papers, which is why the types of measurements kind of differ. Some papers only provided the singular length and width of the M1s. Some papers provided a range of the lengths and widths, and some even provided the ranges of the widths for the trigonid and talonid specifically, which are the 2 parts of the first molar, the trigonid being the anterior portion of the M1 and the talonid being the posterior portion of the M1. And so by the process of elimination of M1 measurement comparisons, the only species whose dentitions are comparable in size to the dentition of RAM 21539 are the ones highlighted. And so these are Alluridon S Cenostylus, which comes from the family Canidae, Protepicyon raki, which is also from the family Canidae, and Ischirocyon gidlei from the family Amphicyonidae. Like I said, their measurements are highlighted in this table, and you can see that these species show very small discrepancies in their M1 measurements in comparison to the M1 measurements of RAM 21539, with all of them only having a difference under 1.0 millimeters. The rest of the species in the tables have M1s that differ 5 millimeters or more in size. So at this point in my research, I was left with 3 possible species that could identify RAM 21539. So then I had to resort to another method. I then made trigonid and talonid comparisons between the M1 of RAM 21539 and the M1s of these 3 species. So to do this, I found drawings of these M1s from other publications so that I could easily compare them to the occlusal view of the RAM 21539 jaw. And so on the top, here is the lower dentition of Protepicyon raki, and on the bottom, this is the lower dentition of RAM 21539, which we saw on the other side. And so as you can see, the talonid, which is the posterior portion, is elongated and squared off, while the talonid of RAM 21539 is shorter and rounded off. And so because these shapes did not match up, even though the measurements of the M1s belonging to each species were comparable, I eliminated Protepicyon raki completely from my list because it didn't make sense given that their shapes did not match up. And so the next species I examined was Ischirocyon gidlei. However, through my search for drawings of the species, I was not able to find a lower dentition drawing of Ischirocyon gidlei. Therefore, I found one of Amphicyon rigsii. Amphicyon rigsii is from the same family as Ischirocyon gidlei and has similar M1 measurements. Therefore, I assumed that the shapes of their teeth would be similar. As you can see in the top drawing, Amphicyon rigsii has only one distinct cusp on its talonid, while RAM 21539, although it is a bit worn, has several, and therefore I eliminate the species. Even though I made my decision to eliminate the species solely based off of the comparisons between the trigonid and talonid, it also did not hurt to look at the M2 size and shape in order to confirm that my eliminations were correct. So I noticed that the M2 of Amphiocene rigsii was very similar in size to the M1. And so you can see that they're both fairly large, but if you look at the M1 and the M2 of RAM2 and 539, you can see that the M1 is almost twice the size of the M2, thus showing that RAM2 and 539 could not be an Amphiocene. So the final species that I examined was Alluridon S Cenostylus. And like RAM 21539, this species has a reduced M1 talonid, indicating that it is shorter and less elongated, and the two have very similar trigonid shapes. And this is supported. This conclusion is supported by the fact that the M1 measurements are also very similar. Like I said before, the max widths of the trigonid and talonid of Alluridon S Cenostylus are 11.2 millimeters and 11.3 millimeters respectively, while the width of RAM 21539 is 11.38 millimeters. And so the range of discrepancy between the measurements is only 0.08 millimeters to 0.18 millimeters, which is very small. And so, therefore, I concluded that RAM 21539 represents fossils of Alluridon S Cenostylus. To further confirm that the specimen is, in fact, Alluridon S Cenostylus, my mentor, Dr. Lofgren, browsed through the Raymond M. Alf Museum's collections on the species and found 3 jaws. And these 3 jaws were all very comparable in size to RAM 21539, and the teeth shapes and measurements matched up as well. And at this point, this is when I also confirmed that RAM 21539 was a left jaw. And so after I identified the jaw, my next step was to identify and describe the foot. Because the articulated foot was found adjacent to the left dentary before preparation, I concluded that it can also be classified as Alluridon S Cenostylus. Moreover, RAM 21539 has characteristics of carnivore feet, as it consists of 5 carpals and 4 metacarpals. This is a typical diagram of the forefoot of a carnivore, and you can see that the forefoot of a carnivore has 7 carpals and 5 metacarpals. And so even though RAM 21539 was missing a few, it still had the majority of carpals and metacarpals present. And so the typical carpals in the forefoot of a carnivore are trapezium, trapezoid, magnum, unciform, pisiform, cuneiform, and scapholiniar. And the metacarpals are metacarpals 1 through 5. And so you can see in the image that the smaller bones are carpals and the larger bones are metacarpals. And so to produce a systematic description of the foot, I had to examine the dorsal, or also known as the backside of the specimen. This is because the edges of the bones are much easier to discern from the back than the front, because there is an excess of matrix covering the ventral side of the foot, and it made the bones very hard to identify. And so using the previous diagram as a reference, I was able to label the metacarpals and the carpals of the foot. And so as you can see, RAM 21539 has metacarpals 2 to 5 present and is only missing the pisiform and the cuneiform in terms of its carpals. If the carpals were present, the pisiform would extend from the proximal end of metacarpal 5, and the cuneiform would extend from the proximal end of the unciform. In the end, I concluded that RAM 21539 was a right forefoot because the specimen matched up well with the carnivore forefoot diagram I displayed in the previous slide. And so to conclude my presentation, I would just like to talk about the significance of these findings. The Barstow Formation, particularly the upper member, is rich in fossils of Miocene age. Alluridon S Cenostylus is one of the 13 carnivore species that has been documented from the upper member. Most specimens of Alluridon S Cenostylus are from the Barstow Formation fauna. So far, specimens of such species have been excavated from 8 different quarries in the upper member of the formation, which is a pretty significant amount. And the articulated jaw and foot presented in this paper is just another one of those occurrences in the upper member. The upper member in particular is known to have great preservation potential for preserving articulated specimens like RAM 1211539 because it is dominated by floodplain and near channel deposits. Thank you all for listening, and now Nathan will present his research.
All right, so actually right before I start talking about my presentation, there was one more presenter that we had with us, Will Leah, also a senior, class of 2022, and sadly he was unable to attend. And so I'm going to give a quick summary of what his paper was going to be. And so he did a study on a camel that we also found from the Barstow Formation. And so on April 30th, 2005, they found this really large camel that you can see in the picture here. It's currently on display in the museum. It was found from RAM locality V2000047. And so some unusual things were it was missing part of the skull, and its forelimbs were partially disarticulated. But it was such a large specimen that once they found it, it took 2 trips to excavate it and to end up repairing it. And so they took it and they flew it from Chino Airport nearby where they'd found it to Webb. And originally they had labeled it as Protolabus, which is one of the genera. And so though they originally named it this, it ended up being finally described later on. And so what they found out is so metacarpals and metatarsals, we think about them as typically like our feet bones, like the long bones in our feet. But for animals that are more similar to like camels and cattle, they're actually part of the lower area of the legs. And so metacarpals, which are on the forelimbs, are actually proved to be much longer in the specimen than in Protolabus. And then the back legs were actually much shorter than Protolabus. And so they ended up determining that it wasn't belonging to this genera. And so Willie did research on this to figure out what kind of specimen it was. And after a while, he determined that it was either Apicamelus or Procamelus. And one of the big problems that he faced is that they're very difficult to distinguish because they're very similar in features. One of the problems that happened is when these genera were named, a lot of the species that got attributed to each genera sometimes ended up switching classifications. So one of them might have started as like Apicamelus, but then later on it was renamed under Procamelus or vice versa, which made the genera really confusing to differentiate. But at the end, they ended up asserting that it was most likely to be Apicamelus because Apicamelus has been found far more often in the Barstow Formation. So they decided it was going to be more likely. And so we can kind of skip through the slides to the end of the presentation, but that's kind of what Willie's presentation was supposed to be about. Yeah. And then, then we'll get started on my own presentation, which I know much more about. And so, So what I ended up researching is an Antelope Caprid, and if you don't know what that is, it's a horned animal that's most similar to a pronghorn. It sounds similar to antelope, so that's kind of how I remember it. And other things within the suborder, other animals, like modern animals, are like deer and cattle, though most of Antelope Caprids are currently extinct. In 2010, we discovered this specimen that you can see on the screen, RAM 24964. And originally when it was found, this huge chunk of rock, there wasn't much that you could see. And it was like, well, we can't see very much of it. There's this round area on the screen, roughly around the middle and slightly to the left, and that's the skull. You can see the teeth near the bottom and slightly towards the right. And then you can see the tibia on the far right end. And so when these were originally discovered, there weren't very many pieces. People just thought it was just a few bone fragments, and so no one really cared. It was kind of put away in the archives, and it wasn't worked on. But 10 years later, in 2020, they ended up doing prep work on it. And next slide. And so this is what it ended up looking like after prep was done. And so you can see there are a lot more bones. In the upper left area, you can see this like that same roundish shape that belongs to the skull. Farther down, you can see the vertebra sticking out from the side of the rock. There is a tibia that's between the skull and the vertebrae. It's this long bone in the middle. And in the very bottom right corner, you can see at the very edge of the rock, you can see there are these little bones that belong to the legs. And so we ended up finding all of these bones, and it was like, oh my gosh, we have to start prepping this a ton now. And so after prepping it, next slide, here's what it looks like now. And so this looks very complicated. All of a sudden, there's a lot more bones than we originally thought. And so on the left general side, you can see that there are a lot of long bones, and those are all going to be legs. A few interesting things is we don't really have the time to like explain every single thing on this slide, but you can see the tibia at the bottom, which seems really out of place because it's not only nowhere near the legs, but it's next to the skull and the vertebrae, which is a little bit confusing. And then in the upper right, you can see the tibia and next to it the upper teeth, which are actually really far away from its associated parts, which implies that when the animal died, it decomposed and its skeleton was left behind, it was disarticulated, so the bones ended up like falling out of place. And then it was weathered a bit. So it was probably on the surface for a bit because a lot of the bones are missing key parts of it. So it was definitely left on the surface before it was buried under rock. And so we're going to be talking about the details about each of these on the next slide. And so we're going to, on this slide, you can see this like very ball-like rounded shape that starts to flatten out in the middle to the left, and that's going to be the skull. It's really difficult to tell from this angle, but the left side is the front of the skull, and the right side is the back of the skull. And one of the biggest reasons we can tell that is because right to the right of the skull are two vertebrae. And so it's these two really weird shaped things around the middle. And so these vertebrae are going to be called the atlas and the axis. And they're the first two cervical vertebrae. We can find them like right behind, right at your neck, like the top of your neck. And so these are probably the two most important vertebrae because they are key to head rotation. It allows you to move your head as far as you can. And it allows you to make nodding motions. So that's really important. And then right above that are teeth. And so we're going to be talking about that in the next slide. And so here's a close-up of the teeth. You can see it's a little difficult to tell, but you can see these little humps, and those are the roots of your teeth. And so the first, from left to right, the first three make up the back molar, the M3. And then every two roots is the M2, the second molar, the first molar, and then the last premolar. And so now, of course, everyone has like 4 M3s. Like they have the third molar in 4 places in their mouth. And so the question is, how do we figure out what part of your teeth it belongs to? And so we look at the size and the shape of the teeth that determine upper and lower. So for artiodactyls, the 3 roots in the third molar tell you that it's going to be lower. In the upper, it only has 2 roots. And then another thing is you can tell what's left and right by which side faces outward and which side faces inward of the teeth. So on the top is like the flat side of the teeth, and on the bottom is like the sharper side of the teeth. And so you can end up figuring out that because this is a bottom, it's going to be the right jaw, because the pointing ends of the teeth actually stick out towards the outward cheek side of your jaw, whereas facing inward is the flatter side. And so for a lot of vertebrates, teeth is going to be really important in figuring out which species is which. Next slide. So this is actually the most recent amount of teeth that we've discovered, and these are going to be in upper M2 and M3, so they're going to be in the upper side of your jaw. And so the reason we can tell this is the bottom tooth, which it looks like it might be 2 teeth, but it's actually 1 tooth, is it only has 2 roots. So there's only 2 sections to it. So it's different from the one we saw in the last picture because the M3 there has 3 roots. And so Another thing to note is that this was actually found pretty far away from the other teeth. And so, like I talked about before, it was probably disarticulated and fell all over the place and moved around. Next one. So moving down the line, we're going to be seeing these vertebrae. And so the vertebrae have these little things sticking out of the tops, and it looks like it's stretching downwards, but it's actually stretching outwards. And so these are going to be the spinous and transverse processes. And the shape and size of them are going to tell us which kinds of vertebrae they are. And so because the spinous processes are pretty long and the transverse processes are not very long, we can actually determine that these are lumbar vertebrae. So these are kind of around the height of your stomach. That's kind of where the lumbar vertebrae are. And so it's difficult to see the last one, but it's all 6 vertebrae that they have in, like Antelope Caprids have 6 lumbar vertebrae, and you can kind of see 1 through 6. So it's kind of hard to see the last one, which is at the very far end. And then you've got the tibia, which is kind of the bone that is running underneath the vertebrae. And it's a little peculiar for it to be there, but if its legs collapsed from underneath it, it's possible that the vertebrae could have rested on that bone. And then if you look at the second from the left vertebrae, it looks like it has a small extension coming out of the bottom, but that's not actually an extension. That's actually what's called a calcaneum. And so calcaneums, we know them as like heel bones. But since like Antelope Caprids, their legs are much higher, like it's kind of like they're standing on their tippy toes all the time. So the heel bone's actually up in the air and it's connected to the tibia. And out underneath the vertebrae is going to be these later leg bones that we're going to be talking about on the next slide. And so it looks like there's kind of 1 leg, but it's actually 2. In the back of the picture, you can see next the vertebrae are in the top right, and stretching out from them is what's known as a metatarsal. And so metatarsals are going to be like, while there are foot bones, it's best to think of them as another bone segment that makes up the leg. And so they're going to be in the back, so they're going to be back legs. And so that extended from the calcaneum we just talked about. And underneath, the pretty obvious leg we see in the foreground is at the very bottom left, there's this little like group of bones. And so those are going to be known as the they're going to be known as tarsals. So it's a group of small bones. It's like our foot bones. And then there's a small bone at the very bottom that is a phalanx. And then for the more obvious bone that we have here, there's a pretty, right underneath the metatarsal we talked about is a broken off humerus. And it looks like it's connected to the ulna, which is fully articulated, but the radius is kind of broken apart. So it's pretty difficult to see. On the far left, it looks like it connects with a little bit of rock, but also it looks like bone. And so that grouping of bones is known as the carpals because they're part of the front leg. So, and then it's going to be connected to the metacarpals because they're after the carpals. And so that's going to be that big bone you see in that front that has those weird ridges at the end on the right side. And finally, that's going to touch the first phalanx. And the phalanxes in humans are like fingers. And then next slide. This is one of the more difficult bones to identify because it was found so far away from the rest of the body. But this is actually a tibia. And yes, it is the same kind of tibia as the one we saw underneath the vertebrae. And the reason we can figure this out is because we look at the ends of the bone. And the end of the bone seems to fit in the way a tibia would fit. And so that's how we figure out it's a tibia. And the way to think about it is it kind of fits like a 3D puzzle. It's not perfect, but it sort of clicks in once you find it. And then next slide. This is kind of the last section in which there's this innominate, and the innominate is better known as the pelvis. And so there are 3 parts, the ilium, ischium, and pubis. It's a little hard to tell here, and I don't really need to point out the specifics, but all 3 are present. The only thing that's kind of damaged is the sacrum, which is kind of the like tailbone that we have. And so it's in the middle to the right, and it looks like it's just like a half their bone, and so that was partly damaged, but a lot of the pelvis, at least the top surface, is intact, which is really great. And so next slide. After we uncovered all this stuff, it was time for me to start doing research. And so in 2020, we began doing lots of research, figuring out like, what species is this? And so if you, the bone size and the structure was typical of Antelope Caprids, but the question was, which Antelope Caprid? And so because it's common in Barstow, we had to look at the Barstow formations like biostratigraphy. But so basically we look at the rock, we figure out how old it is, and then we match it with the animals we find in that rock. And so we've probably already seen this chart before. And so the part I've highlighted is the later rock, known as the BA2, or the second biochron. And so the Barstow Formation was found in rock that belongs to the second biochron. And so we were looking for an artiodactyl from that area. And so we narrowed it down to 4. There were 3 other options, which are called Rhacomeryx rhachi, Dromameryx joricanus, and Meriamaceros coronatus, but we ended up getting rid of them because none of them were from BA2. They were all from BA1. And so the remaining options we had were Ramoceros brevicornis, Costerix furcatus, Paracosterus alticornis, and Mericotus nicatus. Next slide. And so typically speaking, we use horn cores to compare, and horn cores are just the bone part of the horn. So we typically use those to compare for Antelope Caprids because they're all very distinct. And so you can see here there's Paracosterix bergensis and Costerix furcatus, and you can kind of see like the way in which the shaft is, it's curved differently. They have different thicknesses and different lengths. Sometimes they break out and branch out at different angles. And then sometimes they have different tines, or the number of little things sticking out from the tops of their head. And so this is really great, and it's really easy to identify, but the specimen didn't have any horns, which means it's probably female. So we had to figure out other means. And so next slide. We ended up using teeth as our second comparison. Like I said earlier at the beginning of the presentation, it's really easy to figure stuff out with teeth. And so the other features aren't really as reliable for Antelope Caprids besides teeth and horns, because a lot of them have lots of similarities. And so Paracosterix and Costerix molars ended up not fitting. They weren't the same shape. They were too long. And so they ended up not being the potential species. But the problem is one of the researchers who's done a lot of research at the Barstow Formation noted that Ramoceros and Mericotus, the 2 remaining species, are pretty much identical beyond horns. So it's become extremely difficult to figure out what it is. And so as we keep researching, we're going to continue to uncover more and see if we can still find out what species it belongs to. And then currently we're writing a scientific paper that we're going to publish that's about this. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody so much. Those were really, really cool presentations, and I think I just want to remind everybody that what you saw today were 3 of our Pecker Scholars who are all in high school, right? So graduating seniors who have done like some really, really cool, amazing work. For the 3 of you, when you started doing research, what was that like? Was it like, did you have a different idea of what research would be like before you started doing it?
For me, I didn't know that research would be such a long process. Like when I first started, I was given just such little information about like the specimens. I was only given like the locality number and like what the specimens could possibly be, but I was given like no other information. And so it really surprised me that like it would take me like almost like a year to be able to like identify like the specific specimens that I was researching in particular.
I agree with Rachel. When I first started, I saw like research as like this big abstract idea, but I feel like once we took like classes in our like sophomore year about like honors museum research, like with more context about and like background about researching, I feel like it was much easier to understand what we were doing, and it was so satisfying when everything like finally falls into place.
For me, when I was like initially doing my research, yeah, like Rachel said, it's a really slow process. We spent a lot of time just trying to get our references together, finding lots of papers. And I remember I was looking, and one thing that's kind of interesting is for some people, you'll run into the problem that you won't have enough information, not simply because you can't find it, but sometimes because it just doesn't exist. And so that's kind of difficult. And then once you finally get it all together, it's really funny because you put it all together and you're like a month or two has passed and it's like, wow, like I feel like I've done so much already. And then like Doc has to, or one of the teachers has to remind you, you're only done with the references. You haven't really done much of anything. And you're like, wow. So like 2 years feels like a long time, but actually it's like, it's kind of necessary.
I remember exactly that same feeling when I started doing research too. Um, this program is really, really unique in in the world. Maybe it was created by Dr. Lofgren, who is the director emeritus at the museum, and has been really, really enhanced and grown thanks to our current director, Dr. Farkey. For the three of you, when you were coming to the program, what was it kind of like working with Dr. Lofgren and Dr. Farkey, and working with actual paleontologists? That's not probably something you think of when you get into high school, right?
Yeah, it was like pretty amazing to be able to work with actual paleontologists. I mean, like you said, like it's such a unique experience that not a lot of high school students have. And for the past 2 years, both like Dr. Farkey and like Dr. Lofgren have been so helpful, at least for me, in like conducting like my research. I mean, like last year when we were all doing online school, Dr. Lofgren put in the extra effort to like take pictures of my specimens and really like just support me along the way. And I'm really grateful to him and to Dr. Farkey for all the help that they've given me.
And I thought it was really interesting how like it's not like a normal classroom because sometimes like Dr. Lofgren and Dr. Farkey don't know either, and we're kind of researching and discovering like what certain fossils are together. So I really enjoyed that.
I actually had two different experiences with the museum. So the first, like I talked about, was me starting research, but another start I had was when I first started the museum activity. And so that was actually really interesting. Like it's pretty different from doing research, but it's really crazy just to see like all the processes that paleontologists go through to get from like rock to like research paper. It's pretty crazy. So just watching all of that was pretty fascinating.
That's awesome. I think for the three of you, like, raise your hand if anyone's looking to be a paleontologist, really quick. All right, cool. Well, for Rachel and Laura, like for you two, since you're not going into paleontology, how do you think the research program has helped prepare you for your future careers in college? And then for Nathan, how do you think this has, set you up to go forward in your career?
I think like research has really shown me like how much dedication and like time commitment I have to like put into my work. And I feel like it has really prepared me like at a young age to be able to research complex things. And when I go into college and when I go into graduate school, like later on, I feel like I'll be really prepared because we learned like that time commitment at such like an early age.
For me, I think research helps a lot with like reading difficult papers, and it helps me like decipher information, and I think that will be really helpful, and it also helps put things into perspective, like how one research paper fits into the history of the world and what that means like in the big picture.
For
Awesome. Laura, you confused me because you were in one screen and then all of a sudden you were there too with Rachel. Um, so, you've all talked about some of the cool experience you've had. Has there been anything that's been like kind of fun that the memory that you'll remember, like either on a peccary trip or working in the research lab or something like that?
Bakery trip. And like the first incident was that someone screamed that there was a snake, and we were sleeping under the stars, but there really wasn't. And we all screamed and like stood on the tables. And then after that settled down, we went to bed and like got in our sleeping bags. And then it started raining in the middle of the night, and we didn't have tents over us, so we all had to squish into the vans. And while like in the moment, it was like not nice to be waking up in the middle of the night. I think it was like one of my most memorable moments from the peccary trip.
For me, I would also have to say like the peccary trips are like pretty memorable. I remember Dr. Lofgren telling us that we were using the same like peccary pans to like cook our meals as like the researchers and like the students who used them like 70 plus years ago. So I personally thought that was pretty cool how like the peccary pans like still like are super like intact and like are like can be used, and like I just thought that was like really cool that we were like eating from the same pans as them.
For me, like, what do I say? Like, I've had a lot of memories that have been associated with this. I remember, like, freshman year, for example, we were all, like, having a good time. We had some free time, and I watched one of my friends, one of the kids in our grade, he just kind of, like, walked off in another direction, started climbing up a hill. And he wasn't the kind of kid to do this kind of physical exercise. And we were like, so what are you doing? And he goes up to this thing and he's holding something in the air like it's like the Lion King or something. And he comes back down and we find out later he was trying to get Signal to play League of Legends, which was really funny. And then another time on one of the later peccary trips, we were in a van and the van was really cool. I love that van, Van 9 all the way. But we were like just as we were about to start, like we reached into the like then there's an air vent and or air conditioning vent, and it was like the thing was removed. So one of my friends put a hand in the van's like vent to see where it went, and he ended up pulling out like a bag of potato chips. So yeah, I've had a lot of really fun but really strange memories at my time at the related to paleo.
I guess there's a lot of fun things that could randomly happen when you're working in potato chips, really, Nathan? All right, cool. Well, we're coming down to the end of our time here on Moments of Time, so I want to say really quick thank you all so much for sharing your research, sharing a little bit about your experiences. We're all so proud of you at the museum. Obviously, as you all saw today, they've done such great work in their research and come a long way from freshmen to these amazing scientists who haven't even gotten into their college yet. So it's a really cool thing. So congrats to all of you. Uh, Before we close off, what would you say to maybe some future web students or even some future students anywhere who is interested in maybe trying research, but it just seems scary to them?
I would say, honestly, just go for it. Just try it out. Like for me, I know I personally was nervous to join like the honors paleontology program and like the advanced studies in paleontology program, just because I was not very like familiar with like paleontology before I came to the Webb schools. But it's a very rewarding experience, and you contribute to science, which is also pretty amazing in my opinion.
I would also say to go for it. Like this year, Dr. Lofgren has been telling this like that to us like the whole time because we have so many like papers that we're working on. And I would just also say like take it one step at a time. Like once you break everything down into like smaller parts, it isn't as bad as it seems.
For me, it's kind of two things. The first is get friends who also have the same interests, because sometimes it goes one way or the other, but sometimes you want to do something and they join in. Now everyone wants to do it, Or sometimes it's the other way around. Like they want to do it and then they kind of make you do it too. And then you kind of get in regardless of whether or not you wanted it to. But then it's like great and everything. And then the other thing is it's going to be really confusing at first, and you kind of just have to go with it and take it for all whatever mess it is. And eventually it's going to take a while. It's going to take a while. But you're going to figure it out eventually. And once you do, it's pretty rewarding.
Awesome. Again, thank you. Thanks to all three of you for joining us today, sharing about your research and your time. And thanks so much to all of our audience at home. Sorry for some of the technical difficulties today, but hopefully you're all able to enjoy the great research stories that the three of them have presented today. If you really like kind of what you saw today and want to help support education and research at the Alf Museum, you can actually find links on how to do that in the description below. And if you want to stay tuned for next month, our moment of time will be following 4 alumni who have graduated from the Webb Schools but have all been through the Precary program. So we'll be able to actually learn kind of how the paleontology program has helped them in their careers after they left Webb. So that'll be really, really cool. So make sure to tune in next month for that. And as usual, make sure you like and subscribe for more stories from the world of paleontology. Thank you all so much, and we will see you next month. Bye, everybody.